They didn't just kill her, they turned her severed head into a weapon of terror. In the blood-soaked crucible of the French Revolution, a time when justice and savagery became indistinguishable and the guillotine's blade sang its daily hymn of death, there lies a story so horrific, so profoundly cruel, that even the hardened citizens of revolutionary Paris recoiled in stunned silence. It is the story of Princess Marie-Thérèse Louise de Savoie-Carignan, known to history as the Princess de Lamballe, whose murder on September 3rd, 1792 stands as one of the most brutal executions in history and a grim testament to how far human beings can sink when consumed by hatred and mob violence. Her demise was not merely a killing, but a carefully orchestrated spectacle of horror designed to inflict maximum psychological torment upon her closest friend, Queen Marie Antoinette, whose own tragic fate would soon follow. Born into the exalted House of Savoy, the Princess de Lamballe had known both the rarefied air of European royalty and the crushing weight of personal sorrow shaped by a loveless political marriage and early widowhood, yet none of that could have foretold the monstrous fate awaiting her in the streets of Paris, a city transformed into a vortex of paranoia and revolutionary fury, where loyalty itself became a death sentence. As the storm of revolution intensified, the Princess de Lamballe remained steadfast in her devotion to Marie Antoinette, choosing friendship and duty over safety, even as whispers of conspiracy and foreign betrayal gathered like thunderclouds around the monarchy. The mobs of Paris, inflamed by revolutionary propaganda and drunk on their own righteousness, hungered for aristocratic blood, convinced that by butchering those closest to the Queen, they could not only destroy the royal family's bodies, but shatter their spirits. What was done to the Princess de Lamballe was no simple execution. It was psychological warfare executed with grotesque theatricality, intended to break Marie Antoinette's soul. This tale, seared into the annals of true crime, historical narratives, stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history, a chilling example of how civilization can collapse into primal savagery, and how even the noblest virtues like loyalty and friendship can become fatal flaws in the roaring fires of political upheaval. In the haunting shadow of the September massacres, this story compels us to ask whether such horrors are relics of the past or warnings for the future. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover about the Princess de Lamballe will change how you see the French Revolution forever. Beneath the glittering chandeliers of 18th century Europe, in the opulent salons where powdered wigs and whispered intrigues reigned supreme, a child was born into one of the continent's most illustrious bloodlines, destined for both privilege and unspeakable tragedy, a child who would one day become the unwilling star of one of the French Revolution's most brutal executions in history. Her name was Marie-Thérèse Louise de Savoie-Carignan, the Princess de Lamballe, a name that would echo through centuries not merely as a noblewoman, but as a symbol of loyalty pushed to its mortal limits amidst the swirling chaos of revolutionary France. Born on September 8, 1749, to the ancient and revered House of Savoy, a dynasty whose tendrils stretched across Europe's royal families, she seemed at first glance to possess all the blessings of her station, wealth, elegance, and connections that placed her close to the beating heart of power itself. Yet behind the shimmering facade of royal life there pulsed the same currents of sorrow and human frailty that define us all, for even a princess was not immune to fate's cruel whims. At the tender age of 17, she entered into an arranged marriage with Louis-Alexandre de Bourbon, Prince de Lamballe, a man whose title and fortune promised stability, but whose personal vices would seed heartbreak. Heir to one of France's wealthiest noble houses, cousin to King Louis XV, the young prince was handsome, charming, and utterly consumed by a life of excess, his reputation stained by gambling debts and notorious affairs that whispered through the gilded corridors of Versailles like poison. Their union, as was so often the case among Europe's elite, was forged not of affection but of political expedience, a brittle alliance meant to weld dynastic fortune together in a fragile latticework of power. For the gentle-hearted Marie-Thérèse Louise, whose nature inclined toward compassion and quiet devotion, marriage to such a man was less a fairy tale than a gilded prison. The palace walls hung with velvet and gold could not muffle the sounds of her husband's dissipations, nor could jewels soothe the bruises of betrayal. And then, scarcely a year into their uneasy bond tragedy, struck with brutal swiftness. In May of 1768, the Prince de Lamballe died, suddenly leaving his young bride, a widow at just 18 years old, adrift amid courtly intrigues and haunted by rumors that his demise was hastened by syphilis contracted through his unbridled indulgences, a whisper of scandal that clung to her name like a dark perfume. Here, any lesser woman might have retreated behind the thick drapes of mourning, forsaking the treacherous stage of Versailles for the safety of convent walls or distant estates. But not the Princess de Lamballe. From this crucible of grief emerged a woman transformed, her spirit forged in sorrow into a quiet resolve to serve, to find meaning not in fleeting pleasures but in steadfast loyalty. It was this new purpose that would draw her inexorably into the orbit of another young woman whose own destiny teetered between dazzling triumph and ruinous downfall, Marie Antoinette, the Austrian-born Dauphine newly arrived at the French court, whose marriage to the future Louis XVI was meant to secure alliances, but instead kindled fires of resentment and suspicion that would one day explode into revolutionary fury. Their first meeting was not the grand affair one might imagine between royals, but a simple conversation born of shared loneliness, two women displaced from their origins, struggling to navigate the suffocating protocols of Versailles, a place where every gesture, every flutter of a fan could carry lethal political weight. In the Princess de Lamballe, Marie Antoinette found a confidant who understood the delicate balance between public spectacle and private despair, a friend whose gentle presence became a balm against the relentless scrutiny and gossip that stalked the queen like a shadow. Likewise, the princess discovered in Marie Antoinette a soul equally battered by expectation and loss, a woman whose laughter masked a growing wellspring of fear. Their friendship blossomed not as a calculated political alliance, but as a genuine sisterhood built on shared vulnerability, a bond that would in time demand the ultimate price. So close did they become that upon her ascension to the throne, in 1774, Marie Antoinette created specifically for the Princess de Lamballe the post of Superintendent of the Queen's household, an office that carried enormous influence and a generous stipend of 150,000 livres annually, placing her at the very center of Versailles' glittering yet perilous web of power. It was a position that crowned her as one of the Queen's most trusted advisors, but also painted a glaring target upon her back, for in the eyes of the increasingly restless public, the princess became a symbol of all that was suspect and foreign about Marie Antoinette's reign, a reign marred by accusations of extravagance, foreign sympathies, and whispered treason. Revolutionary pamphlets began to circulate like wildfire, their venomous pages filled with lurid accusations portraying the princess as a corrupter of the queen, an agent of Austrian influence, and an emblem of the corrupt Ancien regime whose days were numbered. It was a role she neither sought nor deserved, yet the Princess de Lamballe bore it with a quiet dignity, refusing to abandon Marie Antoinette even as the drumbeats of revolution grew louder and more insistent. Here lies the first note of tragedy in her story, that devotion so pure and human became a death sentence in an age when loyalty was redefined as treason and friendship could be twisted into a weapon. For though she was born into splendor, her destiny would be written in blood upon the streets of Paris, amid mobs screaming for justice, wielding pikes instead of words. And yet, as darkness gathered over France, the Princess de Lamballe chose not flight but fidelity. Even as friends begged her to escape across borders and save herself, she could not abandon the queen who had become her sister in all but blood. And so she stayed an act of courage, or perhaps of doomed devotion, that would lead her to the grisly fate which has secured her place among the annals of true crime historical horrors. But before the blade fell, before the streets ran red with royal blood, there remained the mounting tensions, the tightening noose of rumour and hatred, the storm clouds roiling over Versailles that foretold not just the fall of a monarchy, but the utter annihilation of a way of life. What forced the Princess de Lamballe to choose between loyalty and survival, and how did a woman so gentle become the victim of one of the most savage acts of mob violence ever recorded in the French Revolution, a fate so vile that even seasoned revolutionaries recoiled? These are the shadows we must now enter as the fires of revolution blaze higher and the blood-soaked streets of Paris prepare to claim the life of a princess whose only crime was friendship. Stay with me, because in the next part of this story, the gentle corridors of Versailles will vanish into the echoing chambers of prison walls, and the princess's fate will become entwined with the darkest impulses of the revolutionary mob. In the gilded labyrinth of Versailles, where chandeliers cast trembling reflections upon polished marble floors, and silken whispers of gossip wove invisible snares around every noble's neck, the friendship between Marie-Thérèse, Louise, Princess de Lamballe, and Marie-Antoinette was forged not merely in the rituals of courtly life, but in the crucible of mutual loneliness and fear. A bond so deep, so fiercely intimate, that it would one day spell doom for them, both amidst the blood-drenched fury of the French Revolution, a tragedy that remains one of the most shocking true crime historical sagas ever recorded. Though their destinies were written on separate scrolls of royal parchment, their souls converged as if drawn together by an unseen gravitational pull, the young Austrian Dauphin and the Italian-born princess finding in each other a mirror of sorrow and hope. Versailles was no paradise for the women who inhabited its opulent halls. It was a theatre of silent wars where alliances shifted like desert sands, and a misplaced word could destroy an entire family's fortune. Into this glittering yet venomous world stepped Marie Antoinette, barely more than a child, spirited from Vienna to the French court to cement a fragile peace between two empires. She arrived to a kingdom that eyed her with suspicion. Her every gesture dissected, every smile scrutinized her foreignness, a permanent stain in the eyes of those who whispered of Austrian plots and extravagance. In the Princess de Lamballe, the young queen found not only a lady-in-waiting, but a confidant who understood the crushing weight of royal expectation, who knew what it meant to be surrounded by 1,000 people, yet feel utterly alone. From the moment their paths crossed, something transcendent bloomed, a friendship born of shared wounds and whispered secrets, of tears shed behind silk curtains and laughter stolen in hidden gardens where the eyes of the court could not reach. For the princess, whose heart had been battered by the early death of her libertine husband and who yearned for purpose beyond the empty glitter of her title, Marie Antoinette became a cause to serve, a soul to protect. And for the queen, battered by rumors, scandalous pamphlets, and the relentless weight of being a foreign-born consort in a kingdom spiraling toward revolt, the Princess de Lamballe was a harbor in a gathering storm. Together, they wove an invisible sanctuary against the world, a fragile bastion of loyalty and affection that stood in stark defiance of the tidal wave of hatred cresting outside the palace walls. Their relationship was not merely decorative, it carried profound consequences for the machinery of power itself. When Marie Antoinette ascended the throne in 1774, she created the office of Superintendent of the Queen's household, for her friend a powerful position, granting Princess de Lamballe unprecedented access to the Queen's private and political spheres, along with a lavish salary of 150,000 livres. It was a gesture of affection, but also a political flashpoint, for in the eyes of an increasingly resentful public, the princess became not merely a trusted companion, but a sinister influence, a figure whispered about in the same venomous breath as the accusations that painted the Queen as an agent of foreign corruption, as the embodiment of royal excess that was bleeding France dry. The revolutionary press, those newly unleashed wolves of political propaganda, filled the streets with pamphlets that dripped with bile, portraying the princess as a foreign conspirator, as the shadowy hand steering Marie Antoinette toward ruin. In these lurid stories, the Princess de Lamballe was cast as both confidant and corrupter, a symbol of everything the revolution sought to destroy. Yet amidst this tempest of hatred, the princess's devotion to Marie Antoinette only deepened. She became the Queen's constant shadow, her gentle presence a shield against the suffocating loneliness of court life and the simmering dangers gathering beyond the gates. She was there through every humiliation Marie Antoinette suffered, the relentless rumors of sexual improprieties, the cruel satire that painted the Queen as an insatiable seductress, the harsh reality of a royal marriage that was for years cold and unconsummated, feeding public speculation and scorn. She stood beside the Queen during the births of her children, offering comfort when official duties and political coldness kept Louis XVI at a distance. To the princess, loyalty was not a transaction, but a sacred vow, a calling woven into the very fabric of her existence. Her love for the Queen was neither blind nor naive. She understood the consequences, she saw the shadows gathering, and still she chose to stay, believing that even in the darkest times, loyalty and friendship were the last true lights by which a soul could navigate. It was this absolute fidelity that would doom her, for as the revolutionary tide rose, the princess became inseparable from Marie Antoinette in the eyes of the people, a living emblem of royal corruption and foreign influence. The people who once cheered royal processions now spat the princess's name with venom, convinced that her delicate porcelain beauty concealed a serpent's heart. The pamphleteers turned her kindness into cunning, her devotion into conspiracy, until even those who might have pitied her began to see her as a willing accomplice to tyranny. And through it all, the princess never wavered, clinging to her Queen as the storm gathered force, as whispers of violence became open threats, as the cry for liberty morphed into a lust for aristocratic blood. How could such steadfast love become a death sentence? How could friendship so pure and human transform into a weapon in the brutal politics of revolution? It is in the answers to these questions that the true horror and the tragic beauty of the Princess de Lamballe's story resides, and it is here that we must turn our eyes toward the looming gates of Paris, where the distant roar of the mob grows louder, where destiny beckons the princess toward La Force prison, and the unimaginable cruelty that awaits her for the next chapter of this saga plunges us into a vortex of violence from which few emerged unscarred. It is one of history's cruelest ironies that the very palace which once dazzled Europe as a symbol of unrivaled splendor would become the gilded cage that trapped its royal inhabitants, as revolution thundered ever closer, for as the 1780s unfurled across France, a perfect storm of rage, poverty and bitter resentment began to swell, setting the stage for the bloodiest chapters of the French Revolution and the unimaginable horrors that would befall Princess de Lamballe and those who remained loyal to the crown, a tale that would earn its place among the most brutal executions in history and true crime historical narratives that haunt us to this day. France in those years was a kingdom cracking under the weight of its own grandeur, where glittering halls concealed a populace starving for bread, their stomachs as empty as the royal coffers drained by wars, reckless spending, and a tax system that bled the poor while coddling the privileged. While the nobility waltzed through endless balls beneath Versailles' gold-leaf ceilings, peasants trudged through fields, their backs bent under the crushing burden of tithes and taxes, each day inching closer to despair. This widening chasm between the rich and the masses became a festering wound inflamed by Enlightenment philosophers who spoke of liberty, equality, and fraternity, a dangerous trifecta that now found fertile ground in the hearts of men and women who had grown weary of bowing their heads to powdered wigs and titles they no longer revered. Pamphlets cheap and plentiful became weapons sharper than swords, their pages painting Marie Antoinette as the monstrous Madame Deficit, devouring the nation's treasure in orgies of silk gowns and diamond necklaces, even as babies died of hunger in their cradles. It was a narrative both powerful and simplistic, an image so searing that it ignited a firestorm of hatred that would burn uncontrollably through the streets of Paris. And in the midst of this rising fury, the Princess de Lamballe, by virtue of her closeness to the Queen, became collateral damage, a name whispered in the same venomous breath as foreign spies and traitors to the revolution. She, who had committed no crime but loyalty, found herself tangled in a net of conspiracy theories and paranoia that grew thicker with each passing day as mobs clamored for blood to wash away centuries of inequality. The storm reached new heights when in June 1791, King Louis XVI and his family attempted to flee Paris in the infamous flight to Varennes, a desperate, ill-conceived escape that collapsed spectacularly, leaving the monarchy shattered and public trust obliterated. The people who once viewed the king as a father figure now saw him as a coward, a liar, a traitor, plotting with foreign enemies to quash the people's newfound liberty. And what of those closest to the king and queen figures like the Princess de Lamballe, whose mere presence symbolized the past the revolutionaries were determined to erase? They were now marked as enemies of the people, their fates hanging by a thread. Revolutionary fervor evolved into a seething hunger for vengeance. The National Assembly's moderate calls for reform gave way to radical voices demanding the monarchy's total destruction. The streets of Paris became a living organism fueled by rumor and rage, a place where justice was measured not in trials but in the sharp gleam of blades and the roar of the mob chanting for aristocratic blood. The September massacres were no accident, but the natural conclusion of years of mounting hatred, where whispers of plots to free imprisoned nobles and priests fueled a collective hysteria, transforming ordinary men and women into executioners driven by fear as much as by ideology. It was a new breed of warfare, a psychological revolution in which terror became the currency of power and public spectacles of violence were wielded as warnings to all who might cling to the old ways. The Princess de Lamballe, foreign-born and intimately tied to the Queen, was the perfect target for this rising tidal wave of revolutionary justice. Her foreign heritage alone condemned her in the eyes of many, for in the fevered imagination of the crowd, every foreigner was a potential traitor conspiring with Austria and Prussia to drown the revolution in royalist blood. As the months crawled toward the fateful summer of 1792, the princess's world shrank rapidly from the splendors of Versailles to a city on the brink, where every street echoed with cries for liberty and vengeance. Friends and advisors pleaded with her to flee while escape was still possible, to seek sanctuary in the courts of Europe, where her title might shield her from the gathering storm. Yet the Princess de Lamballe refused, bound by a devotion stronger than fear, unwilling to abandon Marie Antoinette, even as the shadows grew longer and the noose of revolution tightened. Was this loyalty noble or tragically naive? Could she not see that the revolution no longer distinguished between guilt and association, that her very proximity to the Queen was now a death sentence? These questions hang over her story like the blade of the guillotine itself, for by the summer of 1792, the radical Jacobins had seized control of revolutionary politics, and words like mercy and moderation were swept aside in favor of purges and revolutionary justice, a euphemism that would soon be written in the princess's own blood. Yet amidst the chants of liberté, égalité, fraternité, a darker undercurrent pulsed a realization that the revolution's fiercest weapon was no longer merely the guillotine, but the psychological warfare waged upon the enemies of the Republic, a war that would soon claim the Princess de Lamballe in ways too monstrous for civilized tongues to speak. And so, as Paris trembled on the edge of madness, the princess stood unwavering beside her queen, unaware that the tides of history had already chosen her as a sacrifice, a symbol to be torn apart for the sins of an entire class. The question is not merely how she died, but why her death had to be so savage, so theatrically cruel, that even hardened revolutionaries would turn pale at its mention. And it is this terrible answer that awaits us next in the echoing corridors of La Force prison, where the final chapters of Princess de Lamballe's story unfold in blood and screams forever, marking her as one of the most tragic figures in the chronicles of the French Revolution. By the time August of 1792 dawned over Paris, the winds of the French Revolution had become a roaring tempest that spared nothing and no one in its path, and for Princess Marie-Thérèse Louise de Savoie-Carignan, known to history as the Princess de Lamballe, the days of silken gowns and whispered confidences beside Marie Antoinette were over, replaced by the grim echo of iron keys and the fetid breath of La Force prison, a place that would become the threshold to one of the most brutal executions in history, and a chapter so soaked in terror it continues to haunt true crime historical narratives across centuries. As the revolutionary mob stormed the Tuileries Palace on August 10th, massacring the loyal Swiss guards and reducing centuries of royal power to rubble, the royal family was seized, and with them all those whose names had become synonymous with the old regime. The Princess de Lamballe, despite her royal connections and the very real possibility of claiming foreign protection, made the fateful choice to share the destiny of her queen rather than flee to the safety of foreign courts, a decision that stands even today as a beacon of loyalty and perhaps a warning of the price such loyalty can demand. In the fevered atmosphere that consumed Paris, where rumors moved faster than reason and the line between patriot and traitor vanished in blood, the princess was arrested on August 19th and dragged into La Force, a prison that had once been a royal fortress, but had now become a festering hellhole for the so-called enemies of the revolution. Gone were the glittering halls of Versailles. In their place rose stone walls stained with mildew and the stench of hundreds of prisoners crammed into damp cells, a place where the echoes of screams and iron chains were a constant chorus. She was thrust into a world teeming with common criminals, prostitutes, thieves, and fellow aristocrats who no longer carried titles but only numbers and the pallor of fear. And there, under flickering lanterns casting shadows like clutching hands, the Princesse de Lamballe maintained a composure that astounded even those hardened by revolutionary savagery. For even in the depths of despair, she refused to renounce. Marie Antoinette refused to speak a single word that might betray the woman she called friend and queen. The revolutionaries, drunk on their newfound power, subjected her to relentless psychological torture, hoping to pry secrets from her lips that could serve as lethal evidence against Marie Antoinette in the Queen's inevitable trial. But the princess's resolve was ironclad. Day after day they demanded she swear loyalty to the Republic, to denounce the monarchy, and confess that the Queen was a traitor conspiring with foreign powers to crush the revolution. But she would not yield. Instead, she spent her days in prayer and quiet reflection, comforting other prisoners, sharing scraps of food, and becoming, even in captivity, a small light flickering in the suffocating darkness. How many of us could stand so firm when every whispered rumor meant another stroke of the blade, when every passing hour might bring the footsteps of the guards who came not to feed but to drag prisoners to their deaths? La Force was not merely a prison. It was a purgatory designed to break spirits, where prisoners were starved, verbally assaulted, and forced to endure filth and disease that spread like wildfire through overcrowded cells. Revolutionary guards spat curses at the princess, mocking her fine manners and noble bearing as remnants of a corrupt world that deserved obliteration. Yet her refusal to denounce Marie Antoinette only inflamed their rage, further transforming her into a symbol of aristocratic defiance that the revolution felt compelled to crush. Outside those grim walls, pamphlets screamed accusations of foreign plots and hidden gold flowing from Versailles into enemy coffers, all painting the princess as a silent conspirator. Inside La Force, she was labeled a dangerous aristocrat, her very presence a threat to the Republic's fragile sense of security. Even friends and sympathizers urged her to save herself with a single false oath to whisper one sentence condemning the Queen and secure her freedom. But to the Princess de Lamballe, such betrayal was impossible, for she believed that loyalty once given was a vow before God himself, a belief that even the spectre of the guillotine could not shake. Her courage was not loud or flamboyant, but a quiet, devastating strength that shone brightest amid the darkest corridors of La Force. Fellow prisoners later testified to her kindness, recalling how she prayed softly for those marked for execution and shared her meager rations with women on the brink of starvation. She seemed almost serene, as if she had accepted that her fate was sealed and that dying for friendship was a price she was willing to pay. Yet, as September loomed, an even greater terror began to seep into the prison walls, a fear that the mob outside, whipped into a frenzy by revolutionary leaders like Jean-Paul Marat and Georges Danton, was preparing to unleash a bloodbath so savage that even hardened revolutionaries would blanch. Whispers spread through the prison that lists were being drawn up, that tribunals would be held, not to administer justice, but to rubber-stamp death sentences. And at the center of these dark rumors stood the name of the Princess de Lamballe, a name now synonymous with everything the revolution hated, from foreign influence to royal extravagance, from loyalty to a monarchy to the supposed conspiracy against the Republic. The princess who once moved with grace through Versailles' sunlit galleries now lay on a lice-ridden pallet awaiting a verdict that had already been decided by the roar of the streets. But even as the days bled into one another, she clung to her faith, believing that God would decide her fate, whether it was deliverance or martyrdom. She could not have known that the horrors awaiting her would defy imagination, for the revolution was about to reveal the depths to which human cruelty could sink when fueled by fear, hatred, and the intoxicating power of mob violence. And so we stand now on the threshold of the September Massacres, poised to witness the monstrous culmination of everything that had been building in Paris, a storm of blood that would claim the life of a princess whose only crime was unwavering loyalty, and whose fate would forever mark the French Revolution as a chapter of history stained not merely with political upheaval, but with the deepest shadows of human savagery, beckoning us into the next part of this story, where the gates of La Force will swing open, not for freedom, but for the slaughter to begin. As the brutal September sun beat down upon Paris in 1792, a city already slick with the blood of kings and guards and priests found itself on the brink of a new abyss, for the drums of the French Revolution now thundered not merely for regime change, but for a reckoning drenched in vengeance, and at the very heart of this maelstrom stood Princess Marie-Thérèse Louise de Savoie-Carignan, the Princess de Lamballe, whose death would become a nightmarish symbol of the revolution's descent into unfathomable savagery, forever inscribed among the most brutal executions in history, and seared into true crime historical chronicles as one of humanity's darkest hours. The mobs that prowled the streets were no longer content with whispers and pamphlets. They demanded blood, and as news spread that enemy armies were marching toward Paris, suspicion metastasized into a collective madness that saw traitors lurking behind every noble crest, every silk curtain, every foreign accent. By September 2nd, the atmosphere had mutated into a fever dream of violence, with radical voices like Jean-Paul Marat and Georges Danton stoking the fires of paranoia, insisting that only extraordinary measures could save the revolution from annihilation. That extraordinary measure arrived in the form of the September Massacres, a savage spree of executions that would claim over 1,000 lives in 5 days, driven by the belief that prisoners would rise and join the invading forces if left alive. And so it was that on September 3rd, as the mob's roar echoed off the stone walls of Paris like cannon fire, their fury turned its gaze upon La Force prison, where the Princesse de Lamballe awaited her fate. Word had seeped through the city that the Queen's closest friend was held within those walls, and the princess had become more than just a woman. she was now a symbol and effigy upon which the mob could vent all its hatred for Marie Antoinette, for monarchy, for centuries of aristocratic privilege. The prison gates swung open and she was dragged from her cell, her delicate features pale beneath the grime and exhaustion of captivity, yet her posture radiated the quiet dignity that had carried her through every storm. What awaited her was no trial in any true sense of the word, but a mockery of justice designed to strip her, not merely of her life, but of her humanity. The so-called tribunal convened in the prison courtyard was nothing but revolutionary theatre, a stage upon which the mob would perform its grim pageant of vengeance. The judges, drunk on their newfound power and perhaps literal wine, hurled accusations and questions like daggers, demanding that the princess swear loyalty to the Republic, denounce the monarchy, and condemn Marie Antoinette as an enemy of the people. It was a script written in blood, the only acceptable lines, those that affirmed the revolution's righteousness and betrayed the queen. Yet, with a calmness that left even some of her enemies momentarily stunned, the Princess de Lamballe refused to speak words she did not believe. She declared that she could not swear loyalty to principles she did not hold, nor could she utter anything that might harm her queen. Her voice was steady, her gaze unwavering, and for a single heartbeat time seemed to stop as the mob grappled with the audacity of her defiance. But then the spell shattered, and the courtyard erupted in howls for her death. À la lanterne, someone screamed a cry that meant she would not die swiftly beneath a guillotine's blade, but would be torn apart by hands and stones and iron rods, sacrificed not merely as a royalist, but as a spectacle. They dragged her through the prison gates and into the blazing streets, where the mob fell upon her with a ferocity that remains almost unspeakable. Clubs, sabers, and fists rained down upon her slender frame, stones smashed into her skull, her clothing was ripped away, leaving her exposed to every prying eye and leering insult. Contemporary accounts, though fragmented and sometimes conflicting in their grotesque detail, agree on this. The princess's murder was not a mere execution, but an orgy of violence designed to prolong her suffering, a ritual humiliation intended to send a message to Marie Antoinette and to anyone who dared cling to the old world. She was bludgeoned, stabbed, stripped, and finally decapitated, her severed head raised aloft on a pike as a trophy, crimson droplets splattering the cobblestones beneath the triumphant roars of the crowd. And yet, the horror did not end with her final breath. In an act that defies the boundaries of civilized imagination, the mob took the princess's head and carried it through the streets of Paris like a ghastly relic, a grotesque pageant winding its way toward the Temple prison where Marie Antoinette was held. Witnesses would later testify that the mob paused to style the princess's hair, powdering it and applying rouge to her lifeless cheeks, transforming her severed head into a macabre parody of courtly beauty so that the queen might recognize her friend at a glance, a gesture that transformed murder into psychological warfare, a cruelty so profound that even seasoned revolutionaries recoiled. As the grisly procession approached the prison, the mob screamed for Marie Antoinette to be dragged to a window to look down upon the mutilated visage of the woman who had been her confidant, her surrogate sister, her steadfast light in the darkest days of the monarchy. Guards hesitated, torn between fear of the mob and revulsion at the spectacle, until finally the queen was compelled to look. Contemporary reports describe how Marie Antoinette collapsed upon seeing the face of the Princess de Lamballe fainting dead away, her spirit shattered by this final vicious blow. It was a moment that encapsulated the revolution's new terrifying weapon, the destruction not merely of flesh but of the human soul. And so, the princess's body was desecrated, hacked apart, pieces carried away as grim souvenirs, her memory smeared with lies meant to erase any chance of martyrdom. The streets of Paris rang with revolutionary songs, taverns filled with drunken revelers celebrating their bloody victory, as if the mutilation of one gentle woman could wash away centuries of injustice. But beneath the din there lay an unspoken terror, for in killing the Princess de Lamballe so monstrously, the revolution had shown that it was no longer simply a political upheaval, but a descent into something far more primal, a darkness from which there might be no return. And as we stand on the other side of this monstrous act, we must now ask, what price did the revolution truly pay for its insatiable hunger for vengeance, and what scars did this barbarity leave upon those who witnessed it? For in the next chapter of this saga, we will see how the reverberations of this singular death shook not only the royal family, but all of Europe, transforming a loyal friend into a symbol of both revolutionary triumph and moral catastrophe. In the shuddering silence that followed the monstrous execution of the Princess de Lamballe, Paris itself seemed to hold its breath, as if recoiling from the abyss into which it had just plunged, for what had been unleashed upon the streets was not merely political vengeance, but a weapon far more insidious, psychological warfare, designed to annihilate not simply bodies, but the human spirit. And at the epicenter of this cruel stratagem stood Marie Antoinette, now trapped within the stone confines of the Temple prison, a queen stripped of her crown and reduced to a trembling mother and widow-in-waiting, forced to confront the blood-drenched consequences of loyalty and friendship in a revolution spiraling beyond reason, a horror so profound that it would etch itself into true crime historical chronicles as one of the most brutal executions in history. The revolutionaries, those architects of terror and masters of the mob, understood with chilling precision that the most effective blow was not always the guillotine's steel, but the slow, meticulous dismembering of hope. And so, they transformed the death of the princess into a grotesque theater, an act of psychological torture calculated to pierce the queen's very soul. As the mob paraded through the streets, bearing the severed head of the Princess de Lamballe, their chants rose in waves of savage triumph, a monstrous liturgy that reverberated off stone walls and filled every Parisian alley with the scent of blood and powder. Witnesses later described how the crowd paused periodically to restyle the princess's hair, powdering it and applying rouge to her pale, lifeless cheeks, until the features were once again arranged into the familiar elegance that had once graced the sunlit corridors of Versailles. This was no random act of brutality, but a deliberate transformation of the princess's remains into a weapon, a visual dagger aimed directly at Marie Antoinette's heart. And so, the grisly procession twisted its way through Paris, winding ever closer to the Temple prison where the queen and her family languished, under guard, each footstep echoing like a drumbeat of impending doom. The mob's fury was not content to remain outside the stone walls. They demanded that Marie Antoinette be dragged to a window, forced to look upon the mutilated visage of her dearest friend, a vision meant to break her, to crush whatever remnants of royal pride or personal resolve might still flicker in her chest. Guards hesitated, torn between the crowd's rage and their own revulsion at the hideous spectacle, until finally the queen was compelled to step forward. Accounts from that terrible day tell of how she approached the window pale as marble, her hands trembling as she clutched the iron bars, only to collapse in a faint the instant her eyes fell upon the blood-smeared features of the princess she had loved as a sister. It was a moment that transcended mere politics and became something primal and monstrous, the revolution revealing its new face not as a movement for liberty, but as an engine of terror that sought to obliterate not only the monarchy, but the bonds of human affection themselves. For the revolutionaries knew that to truly conquer the old order, they had to poison the very concept of loyalty, to turn love into a liability so deadly that no one would ever again dare to stand so close to a fallen queen. And so Marie Antoinette, already battered by months of humiliation, imprisonment, and the looming certainty of her own death, now bore a wound that cut deeper than any blade, a wound inflicted not upon her flesh, but upon her soul. The sight of her friend's severed head, adorned and presented like a grotesque trophy, became an image that would haunt her every remaining day, etching lines of sorrow into a face once famed for its youthful beauty. Even those revolutionaries who cheered the princess's death could not entirely escape the horror of what they had wrought, for as the initial intoxication of victory faded, an uneasy silence fell over the city and whispers began to spread that perhaps the revolution had gone too far, that in the slaughter of a gentle woman who had never wielded political power beyond her loyalty, they had revealed a darkness within themselves from which there might be no return. And yet the official stance remained unflinching. Radical leaders like Marat and Danton hailed the execution as a necessary act of revolutionary justice, a warning to all who might harbor royalist sympathies or dream of restoring the ancien regime. Pamphlets continued to pour from printing presses, painting the princess as a foreign conspirator whose death had saved the Republic from annihilation, while others quietly shuddered at the price of such salvation. For Marie Antoinette, the psychological assault was devastating. In the days and weeks that followed, her health deteriorated visibly. She grew gaunt, her hair streaked with white, her eyes hollowed by sleepless nights, filled with visions of her friend's lifeless gaze. It was said that even the Queen's most bitter enemies were disturbed by the extent of her suffering, for though they sought her downfall, they could not entirely rejoice in the spectacle of a woman undone so utterly by grief. And through it all, the question lingered like a phantom in the corridors of history: did the revolution truly gain strength from such horror, or did it sow the seeds of its own moral collapse in the blood-soaked cobblestones of Paris? For in destroying the Princesse de Lamballe so spectacularly, the revolutionaries ensured that her death would echo far beyond the barricades, transforming her into both a symbol of aristocratic cruelty and paradoxically a martyr whose memory would outlast those who slaughtered her. As Europe recoiled in revulsion and diplomatic channels bristled with condemnation, the name of the Princesse de Lamballe became not merely a footnote in royal tragedy, but a rallying cry for those who would later unite against revolutionary France, a symbol that proved perhaps more than any political pamphlet that the guillotine's blade could cut not only heads but the fragile threads of humanity itself. And so as the Queen languished in the temple, haunted by visions of blood and betrayal, the world beyond Paris began to prepare for war, for the reverberations of one woman's brutal death would soon shake empires, reminding us all that the line between revolution and barbarism is terrifyingly thin, a truth we must now follow into the next chapter, where the aftermath of the princess's execution unfolds in shockwaves that would transform not only a kingdom but the course of history itself. Long after the blood of the Princesse de Lamballe had dried upon the stones of Paris, its dark stain continued to spread, rippling outward like shockwaves from a detonation, for her savage execution was not merely a personal tragedy but a seismic event whose echoes would shatter political alliances, inflame the fires of war, and forever alter how the world would remember the French Revolution. A brutal chapter now burned into the collective memory of true crime, historical narratives, and whispered across centuries as one of the most brutal executions in history, a chilling testament to how civilization can collapse into primal violence when the machinery of mob justice roars unchecked. The immediate aftermath was a maelstrom of horror and political fallout. In Europe's royal courts, news of the princess's fate traveled with electrifying speed, carried in dispatches that read like dispatches from hell itself, their ink still wet with disbelief. Monarchs who had already regarded the revolution with suspicion now recoiled in absolute revulsion. The decapitated head paraded through Paris, the desecration of her body, and the forced viewing inflicted upon Marie Antoinette became symbols not only of revolutionary fervor, but of a madness that could no longer be explained away as mere political turmoil. Kings and emperors across the continent whispered that if the revolution could do this to a gentle princess whose only crime was loyalty, then no crown, no throne, and no royal family was safe. Her death stiffened European resolve against the revolutionary tide, becoming a rallying cry that would fuel the coalitions gathering to crush the new republic, transforming the revolution from a domestic upheaval into a continental war whose consequences would stretch far beyond the borders of France. Inside France itself, the propaganda machine spun furiously, for the revolutionaries knew that the princess's execution was both an act of terror and a dangerous liability, for while they celebrated her death as revolutionary justice, there remained an undercurrent of unease even among those who had cheered her demise. Pamphlets flooded the streets, proclaiming her as a traitor, a conspirator who would have delivered France into the hands of Austria and Prussia, and yet the sheer savagery of her end planted seeds of doubt even in fervent revolutionary hearts. Had the revolution crossed a line from righteous vengeance into sheer barbarism? Was the price of liberty truly measured in such monstrous spectacles of cruelty? These questions festered like hidden wounds, for the revolution's leaders could not admit that their quest for justice might have unleashed horrors beyond their control. In taverns and marketplaces, in salons and dark alleys, people whispered that perhaps the revolution had devoured not merely its enemies, but its own moral compass. And in the Princess de Lamballe's lifeless eyes, many glimpsed a mirror reflecting their own potential fate should the mob ever turn upon them. Yet for the radicals, the message was clear: let her death serve as a warning that no bond, no friendship, no noble lineage could shield one from the will of the people. In this way, the princess became both a martyr and a cautionary tale, a ghostly figure haunting the revolution's triumphs and tragedies alike. Her story, though drowned in blood, refused to remain buried. Across Europe, writers, artists, and historians seized upon her fate as the perfect embodiment of the revolution's contradictions, a movement born of noble ideals, yet capable of acts so grotesque they seemed to mock those very ideals. In England, Edmund Burke thundered about the atrocities of the revolution, using the princess's murder to warn that liberty unmoored from virtue could become a license for savagery. In later centuries, novelists and dramatists would revisit her death, embellishing or romanticizing the details, transforming her into a symbol of purity crushed under the boot of fanaticism. The image of her head carried on a pike powdered and rouged in ghastly parody of courtly elegance became an icon of revolutionary excess, a visual too horrific to forget and too powerful to ignore. Yet her legacy is not solely one of horror. For in the unwavering loyalty she displayed to Marie Antoinette, even when escape was possible, the Princess de Lamballe embodied virtues that have inspired generations: courage, fidelity, and an unyielding sense of duty to a friend even in the face of certain doom. Her life and death provoke profound questions about the price of loyalty, the boundaries of conscience, and the fragility of civilization itself. How thin is the veil that separates ordinary people from the abyss of barbarism? What transformations take place in human hearts when fear, hatred, and righteous indignation combine into a mob's roar? And perhaps the most haunting question of all: could it happen again? For the true horror of the Princess de Lamballe's execution lies not merely in the details of her murder, but in what it reveals about human nature. The ease with which empathy can be strangled, the speed with which neighbors become executioners, and how ideals once proclaimed as universal truths can mutate into instruments of terror. Her story is a prism through which we glimpse both the noblest aspirations and the darkest capacities of the human soul. As we look back across the centuries, we must wrestle with the knowledge that the line between civilization and savagery is drawn not in stone, but in the shifting sands of human passions. And as we turn now to the closing chapter of this saga, we must ask ourselves what lessons, if any, the modern world will choose to remember from the life and death of the Princess de Lamballe, whose sacrifice, though drenched in blood, still shines like a flickering light amid history's most profound darkness, beckoning us to look closer, to question deeper, and to wonder what we might do if placed in her stead, for the final reckoning of this tale awaits us still. In the end, the story of the Princess de Lamballe forces us to confront an unflinching truth that the distance between civilization and savagery is far shorter than we wish to believe, and that even the noblest virtues, loyalty, friendship, devotion, can become fatal when the world descends into chaos. Hers is not merely a story of a royal court torn apart by revolution, but a timeless warning about how fear and hatred can twist ordinary people into instruments of extraordinary cruelty. And yet, amid the horror, her life still burns as proof that courage and dignity can survive even the most brutal storms of history. The question then is not just what happened to her, but what we would do if faced with the same choice between loyalty and survival. Would we stand firm or turn away? That is the haunting legacy she leaves us, echoing across centuries into our own uncertain times. If this story shook you, made you reflect, or sparked questions burning inside you, I want to hear your voice. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts on loyalty, courage, and how history's shadows still touch our world today. Don't forget to like this video, save it for later, and subscribe so you won't miss the next journey into the darkest and brightest corners of human history. Let's keep this conversation alive.